Hey everyone, it's Craig with the Slycast. And in addition to Slycast, I've been involved with a couple of different podcasts. You know, the one that me, Doug, and Ryan did on a monthly basis here before the network really took off. But I also did a podcast called Big Screen Book Club. And I wanted to share a couple episodes of that show here on this feed because I think if you're listening to this feed, you'll get a kick out of it. So basically, on Big Screen Book Club, what I did was I would take a movie and then the book that it was based on, and I'd have a special guest on each episode to sort of have a discussion about the differences, what we liked about the book, what we liked about the movie, and ultimately if the book was, or if the movie was a good adaptation of the book. So my first two episodes were on the Die Hard movies, Die Hard 1 and Die Hard 2, both based on books, and I think you'll enjoy it. So take a listen.
All right, BJ, so last time we talked about Nothing Lasts Forever and Die Hard, and we had so much fun talking that book and that movie that we decided that we were going to tackle 58 Minutes by author Walter Wager, which was the basis for Die Hard 2.
Yeah, it made sense.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about this is, as much as Die Hard was a true adaptation, more or less, of Nothing Lasts Forever, Die Hard 2 was really used 58 Minutes as a jumping off point.
Yeah, the film really almost has nothing to do with the book beyond the basic concept of holding the airplanes hostage.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder about credits, and the interesting thing about it is there's no opening titles in this movie beyond Die Hard 2, but at the end, you get your directed by Rennie Harlan credit, and then your written by credit, which credits Stephen D'Souza and Doug Richardson. And then there's a couple more credits before you even get to the fact that it's based on the novel by Walter Wager.
Right.
So let's jump into the novel real quick. Walter Wager was an author who had a pretty long career. He died in 2004 at the age of 79, but he wrote a lot of books dating back to Death Hits the Jackpot in 1954, which he wrote under the name of John Tiger. He also wrote under the name Walter Herman and Lee Davis Willoughby. And interestingly enough, he wrote the novelization of the Arnold Schwarzenegger film Raw Deal in 1986.
Oh, really? I didn't see that. I am certain I read that book.
Yeah. So, and he wrote that under his name. And then the following year, he wrote 58 Minutes, which, like you said, beyond the fact that it deals with airplanes being held hostage, there's really not much similarities. It does follow NYPD Captain Frank Malone, who, very much like John McClane, is divorced. And in the book, he's waiting at JFK International Airport for his daughter to arrive from California. And they're going to spend Christmas together. The book takes place on December 21st, or at least that's when it starts. And the interesting thing about it is the novel starts in a motel room, which is really similar to a scene we get in the movie when the terrorist in the movie is introduced. And the thing that I thought was interesting about the book as opposed to Roderick Thorpe's Nothing Lasts Forever is the first couple of chapters of 58 Minutes is devoted to following and setting up the terrorist organization. Going into the book, how did you feel about that point of view?
Yeah, I liked the way the chapters jumped between characters, and, you know, Frank Malone was the main character, I guess, but there are a lot of chapters in the book that he's not even a part of. And we get to see a lot of superfluous characters who are just kind of, you know, they take part in the plot, but they're, you know, like there's the one scene where we jump into the car with the Wall Street guy that's driving, and he ends up crashing into the FBI convoy.
Yeah.
So he doesn't really factor into the novel as much as that plot point, but we're in his head and we're in his car with him. And, you know, there's a lot of characters like that and a lot of chapters like that.
Yeah, we don't actually get introduced to Frank Malone until the third chapter, and he's introduced as the youngest captain in the NYPD. He's part of an anti-terrorist unit, and he thwarts an attempted car thief, I guess, who was trying to steal his car on the way out. And we learn that he's an expert marksman, but he doesn't shoot to kill. He'll shoot to disable. We learn along the way that he was in Vietnam. And the interesting thing about this is, as he's written, at least from an age standpoint, Frank Malone really has a lot more in common with John McClane than the character did in Nothing Lasts Forever.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. That whole, the car thief, that was a pretty clumsy way to establish his character, I thought.
Yeah.
He was looking for some way to tell us these details about Frank Malone, so he has this guy attempting to steal his car. A very amateurish attempt at car theft, I would say. But
Yeah. And overall, I don't want to compare authors because I don't think that's fair, but it seems like Walter Wager, at least based on this novel, was really equipped to sort of write in that Dan Brown style. And I'm not going to put Dan Brown down because I enjoy the books that he's written, but they're a certain type of book, and they're sort of connect the dots type of books, like you said, where they introduce these characters that sort of string everything along. And it's got a really, I don't want to say pedestrian style about it, but it really is sort of leave your brain at the door type of writing and plotting. And there are books like that serve a purpose, and this book definitely served a purpose. It definitely felt like a page turner.
Yeah, it's not a terrible book. It was sort of fun to read, but it certainly doesn't compare to Nothing Lasts Forever at all. In my opinion, that's a far better book, far more enjoyable,
Yeah, and I think Roderick Thorpe was also just a more gifted writer in terms of putting words together. And like I said, Walter Wager had an amazing career that spanned many decades. And there are these books serve a purpose. This is actually the kind of book that you would probably pick up in a Hudson News when you're getting ready to go on a flight.
Yeah.
So the villain in the book is a German terrorist named Willie Staub, who is painted really, really well in terms of he's missing his right eye. He's got this crew of henchmen who are from terrorist cells all around the globe. And basically, the interesting thing for me here was it almost felt like the plot of 58 Minutes was sort of using the plot or the point of the terrorists from Die Hard, in the sense that they asked for these demands or the release of certain hostages that was really just a cover for the one hostage that really mattered. And at the end of the day, all they were really concerned about was, or all Willie Staub was concerned about, was getting this $5 million he was being paid to fund future terrorist acts.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the terrorists in 58 Minutes are closer to the terrorists in the film Die Hard than the terrorists in the book Nothing Lasts Forever.
Yeah. It was interesting, and it made me wonder how much Walter Wager thought that maybe he was writing something that was sort of inspired by a Die Hard type scenario. And not to say that the book reads like a Die Hard book, because Frank Malone, painted as he is in terms of being this, this decorated cop and the lead of this anti-terrorist unit, he really doesn't do anything physical in the bulk of the novel, aside from thwarting that car thief. But then we have the whole sequence where they discover where the transmitters that jamming the signal's located. And then, of course, the final conflict with Willie Staub. But beyond that, the novel doesn't really read like an action movie, whereas Nothing Lasts Forever really did.
Right, I was going to point that out. I don't think Frank Malone leaves the control tower, which they call the cab, until chapter 32, which is 3/4 of the way through the book. So you're 3/4 of the way through the book before the action with Frank Malone even starts.
Yeah.
Which is quite different from Die Hard 2.
Oh, yeah. And we'll talk about Die Hard 2. The only other thing is, it's interesting to see what little details screenwriters Steven D'Souza and Doug Richardson sort of cherry-picked from the novel. And the only thing that I really picked up on, and hopefully you can help me fill in any blanks here, is the church that is sort of alluded to in the novel, and Willie Staub disguises himself as a priest at one point, and a bulk of the climax of the film, Die Hard 2, take place at a church adjacent to the airport.
Right.
Were there any other sequences or any other things in the book that you found creeping up in Die Hard 2?
Not really. There's the Willie Stubb is working for a sort of South American dictator or something like that, which is, similar to the character of Esperanza, I guess. And then there is a moment in Die Hard 2 where they say we have 58 minutes, but that's about it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot from the book in the movie, really.
Yeah, and it almost makes you wonder how far they could have gone before things might have gotten litigious with Walter Wager and his representatives, because I can imagine reading this book in 1987 and then going to see Die Hard 2 in 1990. I'm not sure I would have made any connections.
Yeah, right. It's just the basic concept of taking the airport hostage and not letting the planes land. Beyond that, which is, the major plot point of the book. So I guess, but yeah, I mean, they used so little of the book beyond that it's almost saying it's based on the book is not really very accurate.
Yeah, and I guess that's why they buried it so deep in the credits. I will say the book did a really good job of establishing how you really would disable an airport. And like we said in the book, it's JFK and the neighboring airports of LaGuardia and Newark. And they go through a lot of detail. There's how they initially jam the radars and the communication systems. And then there's also this really great sequence where they have a backup transmission jammer. So I got to say that the end of this book is a lot more exciting than the start of the book.
Yeah, well, that's where most of the action happens, is all the way. Like I said, you get 3/4 of the way through before you really get, especially Frank Malone, doing anything similar to what John McCain does for the vast majority of Die Hard 2.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Die Hard 2.
Well, before we get off the book, I wanted to, my two favorite moments in the book are both this Walter Wager describing people swearing.
Yes.
And I wanted to read those.
Okay, go for it.
Let's see, I have the pages bent over here. So the first one is on page 94, and I think it's when they learn in the airport that all the flights are canceled. Mm-hmm. And he says, at Los Angeles International, a graying grandmother who wrote a syndicated column on manners expressed her indignation in a stream of loud and startling obscenities. I loved that. And then when you get to page 167, let me find this now. I hope I can. Oh, yeah. So then you've got this guy. What is this guy doing? Vincent Babbitt. Is he one of the terrorists, maybe?
I don't know.
He says, the river of obscenities, none of them either original or colorful, had begun well before the microburst nearly killed him. He wasn't aware that he was cursing. The stream of oaths was like some exotic litany, a bizarre tribal chant to appease nameless and terrible gods who might protect him. So to me, those are the two greatest moments in the book, and they're both describing somebody cursing. I just thought that was great.
Yeah. Very funny. And there were quite a few instances in the book where Wager would make that, some would say, cardinal sin of an author to say how somebody said something, but it helped paint a picture.
Yeah.
So you can see that the screenwriters behind Die Hard 2 had a plot to work with and really ran from there. And I got to say that Die Hard 2, I guess, was inevitable after the first movie did so well.
Yeah.
And in 1990, the summer of 1990, in fact, July 4th, 1990, Die Hard 2 came out. And in promotional materials, it was referred to as Die Harder. And I think they've retconned the title now, much like they did with Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they call it Die Hard 2, Die Harder. Directed by Rennie Harlin, who was a real promising action director, up and coming at the time. Like we said, written by Stephen E. D'Souza, who worked on Die Hard, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And Doug Richardson. And it was produced once again by Joel Silver and Charles Gordon and Lawrence Gordon. And we get a lot of returning cast. Of course, Bruce Willis is back, but we get his wife, Bonnie Bedelia, who is trapped in an airplane in the sky, conveniently enough with William Atherton, who was the reporter who she punched out at the end of the first movie.
Yes, very convenient.
And we get the sort of shoehorned in Reginald Bell Johnson, who played Al, the cop he communicates with on the radio throughout that first movie. And then for our bad guys, we've got William Sadler, Franco Nero, and of course the the turn, the well-telegraphed turn from John Amos. I gotta say that Die Hard 2, it really delivers in terms of what is expected from sequels, in terms of it opens up the world a little bit, it raises the stakes, they put more money into things, and I think Die Hard 2 is really a good example of how to make a sequel that works. I will say there are a lot of things that don't work with Die Hard 2, and one of those is sort of the wisecracks that they drop into John McClane's mouth that don't really make sense. You have the two suspicious guys he observes at the beginning of the movie. So he knows he's dealing with two guys, and he dispatches one, and the other starts shooting at him. And as he's fleeing, he's saying, "What is this, a tag team?" And through the whole movie, we get these groan-inducing moments. But for the most part, like the novel, the movie pretty much deals with a terrorist organization. This one from within the United States, led by a former, I guess, Army.
Yeah, I don't.
Trying to think, he's Colonel Stewart, a rogue U.S. Army colonel who leads these mercenaries who are working for General Esperanza. And the one thing I don't understand is why they decided to move the action from New York City and JFK to Washington, D.C. It seemed like a weird change of location. The other interesting thing about it is that we learn that John McClane has now gone from working for the NYPD to working as an LAPD detective. So in between movies or since the end of part one, he's reconciled with his wife and they are now back together. He has shown up in D.C. in advance of his wife, and I guess the movie opens with him getting his mother-in-law's car towed.
Right.
So we get a lot of characters introduced in the movie that aren't in the book. We have the head of the airport police force, played by
Dennis Franz.
Yeah, I know all about you and that Nakatomi thing in L.A. But just because the TV thinks you're a hot shit, that don't make it so.
And I think the thing that the movie does really well is it leads with some action, where we have that sequence which I described where John McClane notices two suspicious-looking guys and a gunfight ensues. So how and when everything goes down in terms of taking the airport hostage is a lot different than the book. Are there any things in the movie that you wanted to key in as aspects that worked for you versus aspects that didn't?
Well, you know, I really don't have anything good to say about this movie, personally. Yeah, I think it's pretty terrible. I don't know how Rennie Harlan got this job. I guess because of his fantastic work on Nightmare on Elm Street 4. I don't know how to get such a high-profile gig as Die Hard 2, which you think they could have had. They pretty much had their choice of director.
Yeah. And
I don't know how he got the job. I don't think he did a good job, though.
Okay.
Yeah, there's really almost nothing I liked about the movie. It's telling that I remember clearly when I saw Die Hard in the theater, and you know, even after not having seen the movie for years, I could have told you the entire plot. But with this movie, I don't remember if I saw it in the theater or not, which I probably did, and I remembered really nothing about it until I watched it again last week. It's really incredibly dated, too, which Die Hard is not really dated, but this movie is, especially with all their talk about technology. It's kind of funny when they're talking about faxes and beepers and...
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, like you said, the jokes are just awful. There's the one where Al says, "You're not pissing in somebody's pool, are you?" And John McClane says, "Yeah, and I'm fresh out of chlorine." What does that mean? There's just terrible lines like that.
Yeah, there's another one where McClane's being kicked out of the command center, I guess, or no, he's in the captain's office having an argument with Dennis Franz, and he says, "What sets off the metal detector first? The lead in your
the lead in your ass or the shit for your brains?"
Which doesn't make any sense, because shit's not going to set off a metal detector.
And plus, Dennis Franz looks very hurt by that, where I would think most people would just laugh and say, "What the hell are you talking about?"
Hey, Carmine, let me ask you something. What sets off the metal detectors first? The lead in your ass or the shit in your brains?
And he also says he would be surprised if Dennis Franz's salary is more than $1.98, which is a really odd number to pull out. But I don't, the Dennis Franz character is so ridiculous as well, because after everything John McClane does, he sees John McClane uncover the plot. He sees him make his way out to the runway and try to save that airplane. And then he finds the church, he finds their hideout, and still Dennis Franz is yelling at him, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
Even after everything they've seen him do, just superhuman feats, And Dennis Franz immediately just always starts yelling at him, "Get out of here, you're in the way, what are you doing?"
Yeah, it almost makes you think that they were somehow trying to set him up possibly as the insider that the group had, where instead we get John Amos, who is introduced as being the guy that sort of trained Colonel Stewart. And we get that turn from him. And we also get Fred Thompson, who plays the chief of the airport operations. And it's funny, I remember when I watched this movie when the fourth one was getting ready to come out, I was convinced that Fred Thompson had the sort of a villain turn. So the whole time I'm watching the movie, I'm watching him and I'm looking for the clues and I'm waiting for it to happen, and then of course it never happens. So
that's another thing about the movie is some of the acting is really terrible, at least in my opinion, including Fred Thompson. I think he's pretty bad. And the stewardess that does a lot of interacting with Bonnie Bedelia, she's horrendous. And I looked on IMDb and I couldn't even tell which one was her, because the actresses that played the stewardesses, none of them have ever done anything else. They don't even have pictures on IMDb. Yeah. And I guess that's understandable. And also Art Evans, who plays like the air traffic control guy, he's pretty terrible too.
Yeah, he was a great character though.
Yeah, it was a good character, but his acting is just, I don't know. I guess the movie, that's just part of how the movie feels dated to me as well though. And also Franco Nero, the guy who plays Esperanza.
Yeah.
That actor's Italian.
Yeah.
I guess he's supposed to be from like Central America or South America. It's a made up country, but whatever his accent is, it's horrendous, and it usually sounds like a really bad Russian accent, but it's just ridiculous. Some of his lines. Another thing about the movie is there's a lot of, what do you call it? Overdubbed voices.
Yes.
What do they call that?
Like ADR.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the movie. It's kind of obtrusive.
Yeah, it almost seemed like some of the jokes that McClane drops, like that tag team one.
Yeah. It
seemed like it was dropped in because he says that as he's sort of jumping over to like a baggage escalator.
Yeah, I mean, usually when you're in a life or death situation, you're not thinking up clever quips. But, we're all used to that in action movies. But at least they could be more clever than what we get in this film. But.
Yeah, that was really my biggest complaint with this movie. And it seems like I'm a lot more forgiving of it than you are. And I can understand when you sort of take, like you said, a timeless film like Die Hard, which is considered to this day still one of the great action movies of the last 50 years.
Yeah.
And you compare it to this, which is sort of, some could argue, I guess, it's the problem with summer movies in terms of just adding explosions and throwing money at the screen. Beyond the bad performances and the datedness of the film, is that really what turned you off to the film?
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I mean, and there's so many continuity errors and so many plot details that don't make any sense. For example, I don't understand the motivation of these villains, and they do really almost nothing to establish that.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I can tell, these are American soldiers, right?
Yeah, they have all gone rogue, yeah.
All of these guys have no problem with crashing a plane and killing 230 innocent people, and I'm not really sure what reason they have, unless it's just drug money or something.
Yeah.
But, like, one of the only things they do to establish any motivation is one of the thugs calls the TV reporter a pinko, Yeah. And I guess that's about as far as they go, is trying to explain to us what the hell the motivation is behind these guys.
Yeah. And there's quite a few people that you notice in William Sadler's crew. You got John Leguizamo and Vondi Curtis Hall, and then Robert Patrick, who went on a couple years later to play the metallic Terminator in T2.
Yeah, he has that terrible line where they're ambushing them, and normally when you ambush people, you don't telegraph your moves, but he waits until the last moment and then says, "You're a sitting duck," or whatever, and then he shoots the one guy, and of course the other guys open up on him with machine guns, but he luckily manages to dive behind whatever toolbox he had. I mean, what a ridiculous ambush to put yourself in that position.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
that, of course, is the scene where we see the scaffolding fall on an obvious dummy.
Yeah.
That's some of the directing that is just horrendous in this movie, where you see dummies and just there's a lot of continuity errors that I was reading about on the internet, which are pretty funny.
Yeah, and this movie is interesting because it was really on the cusp of that computer revolution that hadn't happened yet. This movie is considered the first to use digitally compositive live-action footage with a traditional matte painting that had been photographed and scanned into a computer. It was used for the last scene, which took place on a runway. So I think it's probably that scene where either Bruce Willis is ejecting out of the plane or before he says yippee-ki-yay and lights the trail of fuel up to the plane at the end. I'm not sure which, but this is really, I guess, the point where films are going to start looking different in terms of how the special effects were done.
Yeah. I just get frustrated by plot details that are so obviously impossible that they take me out of it, at least.
Yeah.
Just the idea that he lights that jet fuel and it's going to follow the plane up into the air is so ludicrous, and yet it's so important to the plot of the film.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too, because if you chart the Die Hard movies, they really are an exercise in becoming further and further removed from reality.
Yeah, that was one of the great things about Die Hard, is even though the action was over the top, it felt realistic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case with this movie, so.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about 58 Minutes and Die Hard 2, and whether or not you feel this is an adaptation or is a book that's worth reading if you like Die Hard 2.
Yeah, I don't think it's the Die Hard 2 connection. I mean, yeah, there's so little similarity.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's not worth reading, just in general. It's not a terrible book, and it's fun to read. It's a fun read, and
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's not like if you like Die Hard 2, you should go read the book, because there's not a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, I would agree. And like I said earlier, I sort of lumped this in with that sort of Dan Brown school of page turner type of writing. It's a certain kind of writing, and it serves a purpose. And I think if you're interested in those kind of books, you could do worse than 58 Minutes. In terms of being interested in reading the source material for Die Hard 2, I think you're right there. There's really no reason to go ahead and read it. Do you think that they could have made 58 Minutes as written? And do you think it would have been a movie that you would have enjoyed watching?
Well, that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that. They could definitely make it into a movie. Obviously, it would be an entirely different movie from what Die Hard 2 is. It could probably be made into a pretty good movie, yeah.
Yeah, it almost felt to me like the book could have been a really good, maybe 2-night event on like NBC. You know how they do those split movies where, they do two nights of, 2-hour blocks?
Yeah.
For some reason, when I was reading the book, it really felt like they could have made a 2-night event out of the book for whatever reason. So the really interesting thing here was, as much as we talked about how Nothing Lasts Forever was surprisingly similar to Die Hard, I was equally amazed at how different the book was from Die Hard 2.
Yeah, and well, I came at it from the opposite point of view too, where I read the book before I watched the movie, and I didn't really remember anything about the movie.
Yeah.
Whereas when I read Nothing Lasts Forever, I basically knew everything that was going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the same for me. Like I said, it had been maybe 2 years since I had watched Die Hard 2, but as you mentioned, it really is kind of a forgettable movie when you think about it. You don't really get any of those iconic, memorable moments that you get from the first movie. So reading through, I started out reading the book, taking notes, and trying to track possibly what could carry over and what didn't. And I found myself with a series of notes that would make really good use of if I was writing a book report, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So I do got to say that this was interesting in the sense that we're probably going to run into scenarios like this where you have source material that really doesn't translate to the screen at all. And we'll see when that happens again. And I know we have a lot of books on tap that we plan on doing. So we'll see when we run up into that again. And I will say I'm glad I read 58 minutes, but it didn't add any depth to my viewing experience for Die Hard 2. Whereas I can say that Nothing Lasts Forever really added a little bit of depth to Die Hard for me. A movie that doesn't really need any added depth.
Right. I would wonder if early on, when they first started turning 58 minutes into a screenplay, if it was much closer to the book, and then maybe, you know, they got a lot of studio notes about not enough action and not enough John McClane, and, you know, and then it ended up evolving into this just because they needed an action-packed summer blockbuster movie.
Sure. That definitely seems like it could have been the case. I'd imagine maybe D'Souza's and Richardson's first pass might have been a little bit more in line with the book.
Another basement, another elevator. How could the same shit happen to the same guy twice?
I think unless you have anything else you want to talk about, this is going to be a little bit of a shorter discussion than Nothing Lasts Forever and Die Hard. But with this show, I think we're going to run into scenarios where we've picked a book and a movie where there's not as much to talk about. So, like I said, BJ, unless there's anything else you want to cover, we might wrap this up. So what do you have?
Well, I guess there are some more funny observations about the movie.
Yeah, let's go for it. I'll riff on the movie as long as you want.
Well, you know, like Richard Thornburg, he's the reporter, and he makes it clear on the plane that he has a restraining order against Bonnie Bedelia. What's her name? Holly?
Yeah, Holly Gennaro.
And so, you know, towards the end of the film, she uses a stun gun on him in the airplane bathroom. So to me, that means she is going to prison.
Yeah.
You know, he has a restraining order against her, and she uses a stun. Yeah, she's going to prison after this movie. So, and I read, I forget what the site's called. Maybe it's called movieerrors.com. There's a lot of great stuff about this movie on there.
I remember that website. I remember visiting it a couple years ago, and it is a pretty great resource for finding all the problems with movies.
Yeah. Well, and one of the funny things they say is that in circling over Dulles Airport, a plane would fly over several other airports that they could land at with perfect communication,
Yeah.
including Richmond, Baltimore, and Andrews Air Force Base.
Yeah, see, that makes me wonder why they changed the setting from JFK to Washington, where in the book, you know, they telegraph, you know, how they disabled communications, you know, for all the different airports. So,
yeah,
really, really interesting. And I think it's also, you know, funny how we seem a little split on the movie. I seem to enjoy it for what it is, whereas you seem to loathe it as the summer blockbuster that it became.
Yeah, I like I said, I didn't like anything about the movie. Really. Probably when you mentioned the part where he ejects from the plane, then I thought, yeah, that was kind of a cool part, but that's about 5 seconds, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I found another thing on that movieerrors.com that I thought was pretty funny, where it says, you know, John McClane has the gun from the guy that he killed at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think he's talking to Dennis Franz. He says it's a Glock 7.
Okay.
When in actuality, it's a Glock 17. And he says it's made of porcelain, which makes it undetectable by X-ray. But it says not only a Glock, but no major firearms company has ever mass-produced such a weapon due to functionality issues. And it doesn't change the fact that the ammunition would still be visible on X-ray.
Yeah.
And then it says the armorer for the production team pointed these facts out on set and tried to convince them to change this detail, but they filmed it with these mistakes anyways. And I think they did that a lot with this movie, where they knew the stuff wasn't possible, but I guess you're just supposed to suspend disbelief.
Yeah, you don't want to let facts get in the way of telling a great story.
Yeah, it's just, I understand suspending disbelief, but sometimes it just becomes too ridiculous to do it.
Yeah. So thankfully, BJ, Die Hard 2 is behind us, and we'll look forward to whatever books and movies we're going to discuss next time. And I guess, again, we will talk a little bit about your Rock and or Roll podcast, which you do. And you recently did a series of episodes on Lindsey Buckingham, right?
Yeah, one of my favorites of all time. Yeah, I did a 2-parter on him. Yeah, I think those turned out pretty well. And right before that, I did an episode about Bruce Springsteen's album, Nebraska. I'm really happy with these last few episodes I've done. So
yeah, so if you haven't, definitely check out BJ's Rock and or Roll. I will include all the pertinent links in the show notes here. And I guess, BJ, thanks again for chatting. I always have a good time chatting with you, whether it's for this show now or on the podcast roundtables that we do. But it's always a pleasure to get your insights and your views on things.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It's fun. I enjoy it.
All right, and I guess we will talk to you next time.
I think the challenge in this film really is to see if we can make a better movie. I mean, we made a pretty good movie the first time, and it is challenging to see if you can top yourself.